When people who make a living out of critically examining a medium fail to see the full picture of a work, there's good reason to suspect a coming sea change. The existence of this video might seem unwarranted. After all, Prey was received quite well critically, but I'll be arguing that an assumption most of us unknowingly hold has caused those critics to mistake some of the game's most interesting aspects for flaws. In order to discuss both Prey and its reception, you first of all need to understand the ways in which the game itself forces you to interpret its events under flawed assumptions until the very end of the game. Once that understanding is in place, the game becomes one which manages to leverage a familial drama into a meta-narrative about video games, seemingly in response to its genre in general and BioShock in particular. The great assumption at work, however, the assumption that games are obligated to be ludologically gratifying, comes along and shortchanges players, critics, and developers alike. As if that wasn't enough, I believe that the assumption is the very ideological underpinning of the abusive environment developers are required to operate in order to make their living. In essence, this video is an argument for a paradigm shift which will allow us a fuller, more inclusive, and ultimately better understanding of what games can be. I think this video will make more sense if you've played Prey, but I also think you'll get more out of Prey if you watch this video first. I'll leave it up to you. But if you're the kind of person who's got knowing what happens in a made-up story before consuming it high up on the list of problems in your life, you should probably leave now. I'm serious. I'll be talking about the end of the game at the start of the video.
Even though everything in the world is fictional, we want the player to believe it's real.
Here's what you find out in the ending, an ending that totally changes how the game actually starts. Alex Yu, TranStar executive madman, captures an alien called a Typhon, which is the character you're really playing as. He's only gone and destroyed Earth, but now he's trying to fix that. So he restrains you and runs you through a simulation meant to convince you that you're his brother Morgan, which you may or may not be in some sense, in order to ascertain whether the Typhon are at all compatible to humans in terms of emotion, empathy, and their ability to relate to others. He wants to merge the two into one. This means the entire game, at least as far as everything found in its world goes, is narrated by Alex, so to speak, since he is the simulation author. And he's probably the last person you should trust. The simulation has been reconstructed from Morgan's memories, he tells you, and you're left wondering how much is correctly remembered, how much isn't, and most of all, how much Alex has changed. That's a good question to ask. A lot of what's in the simulation doesn't flatter him. For instance, there's no attempt to hide the fact that he created neuromods in the first place by injecting Typhon material into human beings. And he doesn't see the problem with the way he's trying to fix that mistake. He's trying to fix it by doing the same thing, only the other way around. He doesn't see the problem with restraining a Typhon, killing a Typhon, or using a Typhon, which was, coincidentally, the same way he used humans to create neuromods. He's still doing the exact same thing, and he expects you not to realize. Your takeaway is this. In the same way mimics make you question the physical space in which you play, everything that happens in the story is also potentially fake. The song at the end states that now it's time to beat the mind game because now you need to piece it all together in your head. Or, better yet, play the game again, but without the flawed assumption that you're playing as Morgan Yu. And so you go back. Way back to the one thing which was clearly fake either way, the intro to the game. But with the ending in mind, it's framed in a different light. You wake up in bed, supposedly as Morgan, you go to the TranStar offices, meet Alex, run some tests during which something goes wrong and you end up unconscious. Then you wake up in bed as a Morgan, again. You know something is off, things are placed differently from the first time, the mechanic in the hallway is dead, and once you realize the only way out is through the balcony door, you smash the glass and reveal that you were in a simulation the whole time. What you didn't know when you first started the game is that this is simply the top level of simulation.
You're inside a simulation of a simulation inside another giant simulation!
The purpose of this simulation inside of the simulation is to cover up the real simulation, the one Alex is putting the U-Typhon through. Much has been said about this intro. More often than not, how cool it is to see this glass shattering is the first stop for a critic before going into how the rest of the game left them cold. And I mean, it totally is cool, but if you stop at that, you miss a lot of points being made. One is that Alex is crazy, not stupid. He knows that the best way to cover up a lie is with a different lie. It's also a lie suited to its purpose. Once you break through the glass, you can walk around the simulation set and see how cheap of a trick it actually is. It's basically the old rotating wall trick from which there are scratch marks on the floor, by the way, with the added benefit of high-tech display devices called the looking glass. It's supposed to be cheap, because Alex wants the Typhon to think that whoever created that top level of simulation isn't really all that good at it. Someone who made this couldn't possibly make this. Second, it sets up a theme for the rest of the game. What out of everything you experience, if anything, can you trust? And that's where the message communicated to the player as opposed to the character you play comes in. Even if you've been around the sci-fi block a few times and realized that this intro is probably not the only illusion the game has in store, you won't be able to make any decisive conclusion about events until the very end of the game. All good plot twists work this way. They're foreshadowed from the start, they're relevant to all the events of the plot, but they don't make sense until you have the final piece of the puzzle. In Prey, everything is relevant to that final twist, including all the things the game allows you to do in the gameplay. This neat little intro communicates effectively not only within its own fiction, but from the fiction to the player. A bipartite thematic structure that runs through the length of the game all the way through to the ending. Like two mirrors placed on opposite walls of a hallway, standing between the intro and the ending makes the significance of Prey's events distorted and difficult to not lose track of. But once the final piece of the puzzle is in place, it's revealed that things weren't as simple and disconnected as they seemed at first. Not only is Prey a story about the mistakes of two trailblazing brothers, there's something else going on as well.
There's a metaphor here, you know. Typically, the objective of control theory is to monitor the output of a system and compare it with the desired output. The reference signal, the difference between actual and desired outputs, the error signal, is applied as feedback to the input of the system to bring the actual output closer to the reference. Good control systems and good engineers learn from the past.
That something else is what the Great Assumption has inhibited us from seeing. Where BioShock left most of its immersive sim heritage in the past in order to focus on its themes and ideas, Prey understands that it is precisely that design philosophy which allows a fusing together of its narrative and ludic themes in a way BioShock was famously unable to do. On the surface, the familial drama is a story about the costs of progress, whether it has any intrinsic value and how to deal with its limitations, a story without answers to those questions. But taken together with the ludic part, everything that happens between the start and end of the game, if I were to oversimplify it, the game reveals a reason for that lack of answers. It wants to allow the player to conclude what their own answers to those questions might be. What causes problems for this admirable ambition, however, is how a player can be limited in which questions they're willing or able to ask. So while Prey manages to do what BioShock failed to do, to let the player explore the ideas of the narrative through ludic means, the type of gameplay required to explore the tensions inherent to all ideology isn't allowed under the Great Assumption. The emotional core of Prey, the conflict between Alex and Morgan, centers on Alex's delusions. In so many words, Prey is a modernist fever dream. Alex's development of neuromods was obviously misguided and immoral. He's interested in progress for progress's sake. The modernist ethos encased in poet Ezra Pound's maxim, "Make it new." While we're on the subject of literature, I'd like to first point to how the text you find scattered throughout the station, and the West stood tall, good cop, the neural horizon, survivor's account of the evacuation, and the reference to the Hebrew Book of Judges, are all in one way or the other allusions to the modernist philosophy in their own rights. The most damning of all, the trashy sci-fi novel The Starbender Cycle, where the characters conclude that in order to keep the universe from being destroyed, they must destroy themselves. In Prey, even this really terrible fictional fiction novelist appears to understand what Alex is so blind to. To him, progress not only has its own intrinsic value, but its value is higher than arguably anything. But playing the story that unfolds, the game shows you the costs of that progress and challenges you to question whether that value of progress is intrinsic to itself or not. In the simulation, on the one hand, acquiring, imprisoning, and sacrificing human beings, including his own brother, is one of those costs. With the ending in mind, we must realize that whether this happened in reality or not is irrelevant. After all, Alex left it out in the open for you to see. Under all his pretense of saving mankind, he apparently doesn't understand what makes him view the world the way he does. Under it all rests a solid assumption that progress is an all-encompassing goal in its own right. Every other consideration be damned. Then on the level of reality, on the other hand, he doesn't see how acquiring, imprisoning, and sacrificing the Typhon you're playing as doesn't paint him as having learned anything. So as the you Typhon you're embodying is being tested, so are you. Do you accept Alex's philosophy that progress is worth its sometimes neck-breaking costs, and that it has that intrinsic value to begin with? Or do you, at the very least, start to question it? If you ask me, that's kind of enough. Putting you in a position of asking difficult questions is a great service because asking good questions is really as difficult as it is important. Is what Alex did wrong? Was it right in some ways? In what ways was it wrong or right? And in what ways is there room for understanding and maybe even forgiveness? And in what ways should it maybe be indefensible? Does what I'm doing in any way relate to or even reflect what is wrong and right about it? But Prey doesn't want to give you any answers to those questions it challenges you to start asking. Instead, it gives you the tools to start exploring them through mechanical and systemic interactions with the world around you. While both Alex and the U-Typhon are stuck in a prison of sorts, the difference is that his is an ideological one, whereas yours is only a literal one. Unlike Alex, you're free to explore the underlying meaning of your actions. That's what you do through the gameplay, because in stark contrast to BioShock, the ludonarrative critique of which rested on how the game's narrative themes were undermined by how the game handled progressing through it, the gameplay of Prey fits incredibly well into thoughts on the costs and limitations of said progress. First, and most importantly, there's the gameplay loop itself, the thing through which progress is achieved. The game has been criticized for an imbalance in resources and enemy strength. The enemies, so the argument goes, are too strong in relation to the scarcity of resources found throughout the station. I disagree. There are many upgrades you can pick to counteract this potential problem. Many ways, such as environmental effects like fire or just playing mechanically well to conserve resources, and a great variety of ways in which to face your obstacles, which lowers the strain put on each particular resource. In addition, you can always choose to not engage with an enemy and to instead sneak past them. But here's the main thing. The enemies are strong, and resources are comparatively scarce. But shouldn't they be? This is what the great assumption doesn't let us see. If the themes of the story are questions of the costs and value of progress, shouldn't you have to think about what it means materially to progress through the game? Shouldn't there be a choice? If it wasn't a tight balance, the gameplay would have nothing to do with what the game is about. The way it is now, the game manages to make the claim through the mechanical interaction with the game's systems that a good price to pay for progress is constant deliberation. If you're routinely careful, you limit the chance that progress will result in an even worse situation down the line. And that's an amazing thing for a video game to manage to say in 2017, to say nothing about the ways Prey manages to say it. Second, there's the kind of on-the-nose way you're judged on your use of neuromods. This is the most similar thing about Prey and Bioshock. If you use a lot of Typhon neuromods, the world reacts by becoming more hostile. Power aiding progress is in itself dangerous, the game is able to say through its systems. Where Bioshock's parallel system, the harvesting of Adam from Little Sisters, fell flat because the game balanced out the cost of being greedy, Prey understands the importance of making it costly. And third, rewards aren't necessarily equal to the ability cost of accessing certain areas. This is a choice the game has come under criticism for, but is actually a really subtle way for the game to discuss the intrinsic value of progress. Sure, sometimes there's something great behind that locked door, but sometimes there isn't. You shouldn't attribute that value to progress itself, because it's mostly down to chance. These are three ways: the gameplay loop, the neuromod problem, and the cost-reward calculation of abilities in general, in which Prey lets its player explore mechanically and systemically the themes of the narrative. There are many more ways in which the game either develops on these specific techniques or even introduces new ones, but I think these are the most important ones to pay attention to as you're playing the game. If you're not paying attention to these complex ludonarrative interactions though, if you're not willing or able to ask the questions the game opens up for you, there's very little in that middle chunk of the game that feels important. It becomes not a participatory exploration of the story's ideas and values, but a well-made and fun, although basically meaningless, series of diversions. Even though the things you do are captivating, they seem unwilling to let you see their meaning. The what and the how are in focus, but the why stays blurred. One such instance you need to be paying attention for is the early alternate ending, which seems like an effective but unrelated joke when you first play through it. After being contacted by December, an alternate version of the operator robot January, which Morgan created as a message to himself in the future, you get in an escape pod ostensibly to just leave it all behind, only to be pulled out of the simulation and terminated by Alex.
We failed. This isn't the one.
At first, it comes across as a little meta-commentary on video game fatalism. You don't really have any say in what your options are. And it is that because, great, the choices in games are basically an illusion because they've already been made for you in advance by the designers, and no matter how many they've made, they all exist at the same time. Good Schrodinger's choice, guys. But what does it mean in the context specific to Prey? For that question to exist, you need to assume that what happens in the game is related to the themes of the story, and to know that it is, you need to have seen the ending. So here's what it means. It furthers the juxtaposition of Alex and the U-Typhon. The U-Typhon can simply choose to disengage from the horrors of Talos 1, an ethically valid response, but that wouldn't be congruent with Alex's imprisoning ideology. If Alex wants to test how the Typhon reacts to the events of Talos 1, then what's the point of his little test if significant results are forbidden? The Typhon either passes or nothing. There's no alternative, so Alex's test is scientifically meaningless because it's unfalsifiable. He doesn't allow his hypothesis about how the Typhon are compatible with humans to be contradicted, which is what getting into the shuttle would indicate. The sequence escalates the tension in the narrative, and it's probably the closest it gets to actually revealing the twist of the ending. It says the exact same thing, but in a less obvious, more demanding way. On the one hand, you can give the game the benefit of the doubt and assume its disorganized strands will be woven together. You can start to press your mind for the right questions. And then on the other, you can refuse this benefit. You can assume there's some failing at play that isn't your own. You can get in the way of your own enjoyment of Prey.
I've heard you were clever, so I came prepared to flush you out. Ambushes and hostage scenarios. Ah well, no one told me you'd be on my side.
No.
And admittedly, there are many challenges to enjoying the game fully. and in how the game constructs the concept of player, there's a discussion on what it means that there's this otherworldly entity in every game that controls everything, and is both the same and different in its every instantiation. Because what if that entity is imperfect? Even with all the information the ending provides at hand, the events at the level of reality are open to a lot of interpretation. There are so many questions left either unanswered or where the answer is just alluded to. Was there a real Talos 1? Was it better or worse than the one we saw in the simulation? How much did Alex modify and sterilize it? The characters we met throughout the game, they turn out to be robots in the ending sequence, so what happened to them? Were they ever actual people or just Alex's constructed AIs all along? Where's Morgan now? To what extent was he a test subject in reality? Is he dead or alive? And why hasn't he been turned into a robot if that's how the robots do work? All of these things are left for the player to exert their right of interpretation upon, and to leave so much of the fiction in the hands of the player is truly empowering. In fact, it's part of the point the game is making. With Prey, Arkane Studios managed to take the player-empowering design philosophy of immersive sims and translate it into the narrative. Just like the player gets to decide on how to deal with mechanical and systemic problems, they get to decide how to deal with narrative problems. The tension between Morgan being alive or dead in reality can only be resolved once the player makes a choice, and that interpretive choice is what makes it part of the game's reality. The player is the fire in the equations, as one of the books in the game coins it. Amidst all the constants, variables, and functions, there's you running around, affecting all of them. That causes a problem though, because that fire is both creative and destructive. You are a Typhon in Prey. A Typhon, the same kind of creature as all the enemies you're encountering. Prey is explicitly casting you in the role of both devil and deity. You're the one who creates and the one who gets in the way, because just as players will optimize and min-max the fun out of a game's mechanics and systems, they have the power to do the same with its aesthetic elements. The tensions between wanting to do something and not being mechanically able to, that's what optimizing is about. And just as players will choose the easiest way to do that, they'll choose the easiest way to do that in terms of aesthetic tensions. It's the path of least resistance. It's easier to dismiss the tension between a gameplay loop and a story that seem disconnected but keep rubbing up against one another as someone else's mistake than it is to hold on to that tension for a long time until the game makes it possible to alleviate. Prey wants to keep that tension up until the very end because without tension, a choice, whether it's a small thing, a button prompt, or an inadvertent one, is nothing. Ultimately, if BioShock posits the player can't be anything other than what the game allows them to be, Prey turns that around and posits that the game can't be anything other than what the player allows it to be. What is this great assumption I keep antagonizing you with? I hope it's obvious now that it's the paradigm of received knowledge which states how video games are first and foremost supposed to be ludologically gratifying, and that a failure to uphold that promise is invalidating. But the more important thing, its consequence, is the inability to deal with the growing number of deviations video games are displaying which the universally accepted paradigm can't explain. Ludological gratification is really a catch-all term I'm using to describe the countless ways in which game designers make sure that their games are able to build, sustain, and discharge tension. Game feel, aesthetic design, level design, narrative, audio design, etc. The predisposition, in turn, is bolstered by an impulse to find the cause of the perceived screw-up not in the game itself but in its designer's intent. And all of this leads to a culture of bad faith criticism that ends up hurting the ability of players to engage, critics to analyze, and developers to make games. The paradigm of the Great Assumption isn't able to explain the full spectrum of what video games are, and when a game like Prey comes along like a tall blade of grass, the Great Assumption makes sure that it gets cut first. In no way am I trying to argue against ludological gratification, that's not the point, but I am arguing against how it's taken as the self-evident measure of a game's merits. The vague definition of fun is in the same vein as running time, taken as an indicator of evident value. It's really about tension. The fun of a video game is to offer a hurdle, the jumping of which is gratifying. The first problem with this is pretty self-evident. Fun, vague though it may be, is a pretty narrow span of recognition. It makes sure games which let you explore uncomfortable, controversial, or otherwise formative ideas fall into the camps of weird or esoteric, virtually no matter how elegantly that demanding experience is presented. I try not to compare video games to other mediums, it's really not all that useful. For instance, I wouldn't say that while it's routine for a movie or a book to deal with difficult-to-digest subject matter, games are treated with doubt and suspicion when doing it. I wouldn't say that, but I'm saying it a little bit. Enjoyment isn't about having fun all of the time to all of the people. Enjoyment can be about nourishing something that is only good in small and safe doses, exposing yourself to something normally difficult or painful in a way you can control. The second problem is that it interferes with flexibility. I'm not saying the world would be better with more depressing video games, but that it would be better if we were open to a developer wanting to take their game in any given direction at any given time. If something terrible happens in an otherwise adorable game, why would playing that terrible thing be ludologically gratifying? Shouldn't it be ludologically distressing to play, or at the very least, couldn't it? I am aware that there are games that do this, but they often focus on that alone, which kind of ends up supporting my point, inflexibility. If you introduce a not fun part in a game otherwise focused on ludological gratification and don't make a big deal of it, chances are someone is going to get confused. And on the internet, that means outraged. The last thing is that it just seems like a bit of a missed opportunity because all the tools are already there. You can use any of the tools used for ludological gratification in order to subvert it if there's a point or experience you want to convey. There's no need for a sea change in how games are made, only in how games are regarded and received. I'm not saying games shouldn't be fun to play. A mechanically well-made game is always a good thing, but that it can't be the only thing games are unquestionably allowed to be. This is, of course, way too sweeping. It's never as clear-cut as all that, and there are always many different voices at the same time. It's also not about people in general so much as it's certain critics who make a living from their work. I don't want to call anyone out, partly because I don't think it's a very nice thing to do, and partly because I don't think it helps anyone. So I'm going out on a limb a bit that you'll recognize the sort of broad strokes reception I'm painting here. But just in case you don't, let's return to Prey specifically before I make a whiny, sanctimonious fool out of myself. There's a lack of awareness in the critical community around intentional fallacy, and since the great assumption is unspoken and presumed, the assumption gets projected onto the developers we look to for answers. As it turns out, Prey makes for an interesting example on this topic. It's important to realize that many of the arguments leveled at the game can only be made in earnest if you dismiss something at the core of its narrative, the fact that you're playing a simulated experience. Whatever it is, that the final act is overlong, that the choices are simplistic and too gamey, or that many of the tasks are fetch questy, the only way to make those criticisms and stop at that is to, as some critics have done, dismiss the simulation as a cop-out. If you're just somebody playing Prey for the fun of it, you obviously have every right to do that, it affects nobody. When a professional critic does it though, it's called an intentional fallacy. This is a big thing. It means basing an assessment of the work on the author's intention rather than on one's own response to that work. There are a lot of reasons to why you shouldn't do this. The author might lie when you ask them. The author might be dead when you ask them, and the author might not in fact know themselves what they ultimately ended up making. Prey is an interesting sort of case study for this because former Arkane president Raf Colantonio has publicly stated that the final act of the game was compromised. But here's the thing, that doesn't matter. As a critic speaking for an audience, academic or general, interested in games as a medium, what am I supposed to do with that information? Discuss how it's bad when Arkane probably know what they would have liked to do differently? That's not helpful. Discuss how good the game that never was would be? That's dumb. Now the game is, and the critic's job is to discuss the game as is, and analyze what it's doing. The problem with the great assumption in all this is that it's much easier to infer a reason for a perceived inconsistency from outside the game rather than ask what that inconsistency does within the work. This part doesn't seem very fun. They must have screwed up because clearly that's what they were going for. So if the final act is overlong and awkward, that creates a tension in the work. The critic has to ask and answer what that tension ends up signifying. In the case of Prey, I'd argue that it signifies Alex's meticulousness. Walter Dahl's arrival, for instance, is one of the most annoying things about the final act. He comes out of nowhere, the operator bots he brings with him are very powerful, and his storyline yanks you around the station like a tiny dog on a short leash. You may dislike when this happens, but that doesn't change the fact it's a way for Alex to test the Typhon on how it deals with a difficult ethical issue during inconvenient circumstances. And it doesn't change how it functions as both a foreshadowing of what's to come and characterization of the Yu brothers.
Your brother, he likes a microphone, a spotlight. He can't resist, even though he's hiding. And you are running around like a nervous rat. I hear you, chewing the wires and shitting in the walls.
If you want to critique it, you have to critique the effect it has as a function in the work as it is. A professional critic berating something because it annoys them and wasn't fun doesn't just seem like a cop-out. It is one. What all this leads to is a culture of bad faith criticism where instead of discussing what games are doing and appraise the value of that, the point is to find all the ways in which it isn't ludologically gratifying. This is a corner video game criticism seems to have painted itself into, and it hurts the medium's ability to thrive creatively. Let's look at the choices in Prey. Choices being an ever-successful way of docking points off a game precisely because they can't be anything other than expected and so fail to build, sustain, and release tension. The critique of the choices in Prey is how they boil down to usual video game stuff, kill or save, genocide or peaceful, and that they don't relate to the themes of the main plot. Taking the choices on good faith as the way they're meant to be, though, turns them into arguably the most thoughtful exploration of the nature of choice I've seen in a video game. Arguably, the best choice is the one about Walter Dahl because it's genuinely difficult. Killing him might be morally reprehensible, yeah, but if you leave him be, you're ensuring many other deaths, and if you save him, you end up forcibly removing his neuromods in order to make him forget the order which brought him to Talos 1. Is either of these actually better than the other? Kill a bad person, refuse to kill them and cause many more deaths, or keep them alive only to use and abuse? This is one of the last choices you have to make as the Yu Typhon, and the inconvenience of making the seemingly right choice of saving him can be read as the game giving you ample opportunity to go, wait, maybe this isn't the most ethically responsible thing. That's pretty impressive. The arguably worst or weirdest choice is in how you deal with the fake chef in the kitchen. On the surface, he's just a really dangerous person to keep alive, so you kill him. If you examine it closer though, there are structural similarities between his plotline and the main one. It functions as what's known as mise en abîme, a small version of the story within itself which results in a theoretically infinite reflection between the two levels, like two mirrors on opposite sides of a hallway. What if I describe the chef's plot like this? A fat man imprisons you, taunts you with traps and tests, wonder what he's going to do with you, you end up on a quest to hunt him down only for the climax to not give you many answers. That's the broad strokes plot of Prey. It's another piece of foreshadowing and turns out to be relevant to the themes of the larger plot. And they're meaningful. Not in the capital M meaningful way of being clearly signposted, but because they aren't signposted as such. Only once it's all said and done and the game is over does the meaning of each choice reveal itself. In a superficial examination, they're easy to dismiss on bad faith, but if they aren't a good way of representing choice, I don't really know what is. Under the great assumption, being subtle or clever is a risk, because the paradigm doesn't allow non-traditional approaches to design. If we leave it behind, those tools viewed as principally there to build ludological gratification machines are allowed to also be used in new creative ways. If we leave it behind, we don't get critics routinely dismissing things warranting a closer look on the assumption that developers were trying to achieve that ludological gratification, when potentially, in reality, they just wanted to do something new. And if we leave it behind, it becomes that much harder to cling to the bad faith permeating the culture around the medium. A culture which, if painful but important relations are made plain, turns out to be more hurtful than just isolated bad faith criticisms. It isn't only about Prey, but an industry-wide problem, the responsibility for which ultimately rests with us. While the heritage of Gamergate is both real and still alive, it's sadly just the extreme end of a spectrum, a side that begins with this great assumption and the urge to find flaws based on our own prejudice. The reasons to why this happened are difficult to glean, but there are definitely clues in the industry's recent history. Perhaps part of the cause exists further back in a time when playing games often meant being a socially awkward nerd. Maybe still, it's simply the entitlement of an extreme minority causing so much vitriol toward the people lovingly crafting our games. I honestly don't know which would be worse. But it's ultimately clear that there's an abusive element in the spaces developers are required to attend in order to share their creative endeavors. And maybe starting here, with Prey as example where the language is least hurtful, is the best way to talk about it. One big change, with roots in the mid-2000s, when the indie scene's categorical explosion begun, is the widening of the window through which we're able to peek into the creative process of developers. Less so than in the past do publishers alone have power over what, how, and from whom we see and hear what is going on in the development process. Taking a stance against the publisher taking advantage of, undermining, or otherwise making life difficult for its creative talent, the ones we ultimately owe our art to, is comparatively valid. Inherent to the publishing business is understanding and, more importantly, communicating with consumers. They have professionals trained and experienced in dealing with the dangers, creative as well as sometimes physical, of being a public figure. Ideally, that's what they're there for. We value creative works highly, and we want those with the ability to produce them to be safe physically, obviously, but also creatively. A huge creative risk is when you start to think about what others will think about your work. The trust between creator and editor is about the editor assessing the work with the creator's best interests in mind. But looking at the past years, what's been happening instead? Publishers in the gaming industry have realized that instead of an experienced presenter, you can put a few developers on a presentation stage to seemingly positive effects. They convey a sense of passion, a sense of earnestness, and paints the entire endeavor as cooperative rather than exploitative. All good things. But an experienced presenter, removed from the creative process, also results in a shield between those creating and those consuming, between the needs of the one and the needs of the other. So far, it's a rock and a hard place. You win some, you lose some. Where it gets really messy is when you consider how skewed the power balance between these two needs are. Where the people on stage are restrained due to being public, exposed, and reliant on the other, the people behind the screens have the completely opposite experience. They're anonymous, hidden behind that, and they don't really need the creative entity because there are so many around. With this in mind, not only is very little gained in terms of creative freedom, the one thing every creative will tell you is critical, but the creative talent itself is jeopardized, put in the searing spotlight for what is, when you think about it, mostly goodwill. I'll put some articles in the description if you want to read what developers themselves have to say about it, but it's clear that there's been a change. We see more of the people making our games than arguably ever, but I can't help but think it's part of why the abuse, adverse, and slight has become so ubiquitous. where does the need to be so vitriolic in some cases and just mistrustful in some come from in the first place? After all, both are reliant on that presupposed attitude of distrust. Competence, earnestness, indulgence. Why are we so hesitant to give developers the benefit of the doubt with these things? With Prey specifically, it's so odd to question their ability to make a solid game because they've been making good games for over a decade. To assume that they simply botched the last third of a game they spent 4 years creating, what's sad is we seemingly don't even realize how fiercely insulting that assumption is alone. What's sadder is I don't even really need to mention all the fucking toxic, hateful, disgusting filth creative people have to endure, most of all if they're not straight white men, every single day as a matter of fact, quote, cost of business. An obvious source of the distrust is the fact that games used to be decidedly worse. Now, before you start writing an angry comment, I'm saying games used to be technically worse. Having ideas is easy, you probably have 20 excellent ideas every day, but the ability and perseverance required to make it come true is not. Playing an old game, that axiom shows, and it shows hard. A large part of the charm of playing older games is seeing the myriad ways in which developers of yesteryear bent over backwards to make their ideas a playable reality. At least sort of. More often than not, the technology just wasn't there, the techniques weren't there. When it was there, it was rough, held together by digital duct tape. You could see what they were trying to make. That's where a lot of that energy came from, raw creative ambition. But you could see just as clearly the concessions made to make the result ostensibly that idea. And that's where the awkward nerd comes into play. Way back, people ordered magazines with code in them, code which you had to manually input into your machine in order to play an often very simple game. It was nerds making things for nerds, real OG computer lab nerds. But even later on in the 90s and noughties, these games were too busy being functional to start with to even think about spending time convincing anyone that what they were doing was cool. You had to already think being a wizard adventuring through a dungeon was cool, because the game itself sure as anything wasn't going to make you think it was. And I'm saying this went on for a long time, and again, I'm not dismissing them, I'm saying that's part of what gave them their charm, earnestness, and energy. Even games in the 6th generation, the PlayStation 2 era, struggled to really convince anyone of, well, anything really. To take them seriously, you really had to be on their side from the start. You had to give the games the benefit of the doubt. Maybe somewhere down the line that was taken advantage of. Maybe once games were able to be as spectacular, as convincing as they now have become to such an incredible amount of people who would never play these older games, the influx of people felt like an invasion. I can understand that feeling, the feeling that the thing you gave so much of your compassion to took advantage of that and is now busy catering to these new people who needed to be convinced. I don't particularly share it, but I can understand it, and I think it's sweet in a way. Well, it's only sweet if you assume that those aren't the same people as the ones being so destructive right now. And maybe they're not. Maybe those abusive voices are the voices of the unconvinced, those who came in late and get angry when a game doesn't convince them enough to forget that what they're doing is actually pretty uncool. Because let's face it, video games are almost never cool. There's an undeniable logic to this chain of thought. If you need to be convinced how cool a game is whenever something doesn't quite make sense, whenever something doesn't feel ludologically gratifying, whenever your suspension of disbelief is challenged, you might feel exposed as what you're currently engaged in, nerding out. Maybe the press F to pay respects and resulting memification of it is because it brought the dishonesty and corniness of the military power fantasy much too close for comfort. I realize all this theorizing ends up being a little ridiculous because at the end of the day I just don't know. It's probably a little bit of everything. The people feeling let down in comparison to the leeway they gave games when they required some of that imagination, and the people who just can't seem to handle doing something kind of lame, and the movement to put developers at the forefront all combines into a perfect storm. I don't know. What's clear though is the incredibly entitled attitude of these reprehensible voices. Sometimes I wonder if these voices are so misinformed that they don't understand how many more games are released compared to years past. Leaving one behind is so easy. It seems like that would counteract these feelings in the first place, but somehow it doesn't, like, at all. Is it outrage culture? Is it algorithms? Is it the dark, powerless void of simply being one amongst millions against what is perceived as the powers that be? Here's the thing. Whereas an abusive commenter must have assumed somewhere along the line that the creator has actively tried to hurt them, the critique made in bad faith simply assumes they are to some degree incompetent at their jobs. The difference here is in what you assume ludological gratification has been replaced with. Is it a cabal of diversity-loving SJW cultural Marxists, or simply the developers being bad? A difference is also that where one is impossible to talk with to begin with, the other is working under the belief that they're without prejudice, but is in fact unknowingly working under the great assumption that video games are supposed to be this or that they're supposed to be ludologically gratifying. Whatever the cause, be it power structures within the industry, disappointed nerds, or sensitive meme lords, this all begins here with the great assumption. And I wonder what hurts more, the totally absurd, spiteful idiot or the person who's actually trying to understand what you've made but is missing the point. En masse, it's the idiots, but on a case-by-case basis, I'd argue it's the bad faith critic who's simply unaware of what they're doing. Critics will always do a lot of assuming. That's impossible to get around. But you know what they say about assuming. So if we're going to assume, let's have the dignity and decency to make asses out of only ourselves and heroes out of those who work on games like Prey. Thanks for watching. Thank you so much again for making it all the way back here. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the work I do through Patreon. If you want to know more about how to do that, there's a link in the description. For this video, I would like to thank Micah Edmonds and Cornelia Alquist. It really means a lot. Now, I could probably make an entire second video on the many clever bits and pieces in Prey that didn't quite fit into the framework of this video. Don't worry though, I won't. Well, maybe I will a little bit. I'm not sure what the next video will be. But I'd like you to think about things you'd want me to cover in upcoming videos. The idea is to have a community-decided video produced when Patreon hits a certain goal, and it's been ticking up faster in relation to the amount of patrons than I anticipated, so I don't really have any, well, suggestions. So instead of me hinting at what's coming next, why don't you? Anyway, until next time, keep taking games way too seriously.